I forgot to begin recording this, and now we are recording it. Welcome. We are going to talk about, over the next hour or so, some really important international news. Take a little bit of an international flavor today. Thanks to the politically active students who wanted to have this meeting, and thanks to our guest speakers, who we will hear from momentarily. Before we do, my name is Andrew Crocker. I am a co-sponsor for Politically Active, and I want to take a moment to begin this conversation by just onboarding folks into the basics before we get this conversation rolling and a little bit of a higher plane with our guest speakers. All right, so what you guys are looking at right now, stand by. What you guys are looking at right now is our flyer, of course, for this meeting. And this is a world map of the region in which we're talking about. Up in the left, you see Europe. Down bottom left, you see Africa, China over here. Of course, here's Saudi Arabia, and there is the moneymaker. That's, of course, the country that we're talking about today, just slightly north of where the World Cup is. This little sliver of an island, sliver of a peninsula here. Of course, that is where your World Cup is being played. But the conversation we're having is about this country right here, a country that the United States has a complicated and occasionally troublesome relationship with, that of Iran. Now, obviously, one of the key reasons we are talking about Iran is not just because of the events that are happening there, but because of the government structure there. Some of it you might be familiar with. Obviously, they have a president, they have a parliament, for which the general population can run to, win seats in the parliament or serve as president. But something that we might not recognize is the fact that they have something called a supreme leader. This person is put in place by dozens of clerics, religious leaders in that country. And this person really is the person that quality controls and runs the government. He staffs what's called the Guardian Council alongside the Chief Justice of Iran, which he chooses anyways. So directly and indirectly, he runs this Guardian Council, which can actually delete people from being able to run for office. So if they are uncomfortable with certain candidates, they have the ability to shoot them down, metaphorically, of course, not literally. Now, for the record, back in 2021, they had a bunch of elections that the Guardian Council shut down a bunch of candidacies that were more moderate, that were more reform-based. And really, the Guardian Council is a way to essentially make sure the president and the parliament is consistently marching to the drum of the supreme leader, a gentleman named Khamenei. Now, on top of that, obviously, they'd have law enforcement figures there, and not just law enforcement for laws that you and I would probably recognize here in America, but also culturally based as well. That, of course, includes something called the guidance control, or what you and I now know as the morality police. And they will enforce laws that will appear like this. Women who appear in public without a proper hijab should be imprisoned from 10 days to 2 months or pay a fine. That enters the modern conversation around a young woman named Mahsa Amini, who was arrested back in September for not wearing a hijab in accordance with government standards. She ended up succumbing into a coma and dying. The government itself has claimed that when she was in custody, she died of a heart attack, but eyewitnesses, including people who were arrested with her, claimed that she was severely beaten and died of police brutality. Now, what that means, of course, is that this has incensed an Iranian population, which, by the way, is a lot more complicated and a lot more modern than we here in America give them credit for. We have seen a ton of nationwide nonviolent protests and violent riots as well, as the Iranian government has attempted to squash them. We have seen an outpouring of artistic expression, including art like this that says "Woman, Life, Freedom," very common chant among the protesters. And of course, Iran's World Cup team actually protested as well by refusing to sing along with the national anthem. Sadly, Iran's World Cup team was eliminated from the World Cup, doubly sadly, by America, just to add to the animosity. Now, the protest, guys, this is a national protest. There's really not a corner of this country where we have not seen protests. We've seen protests globally as well. We've also seen deaths of protesters throughout much of the country as the Iranian government has attempted to cut off internet access for many protesters, and of course has tried to squash, arrest, and in some cases kill protesters as they saw fit. This has prompted reactions from world leaders around the world, including Biden himself. He says, "I remain gravely concerned about the reports of intensifying violent crackdown on peaceful protesters in Iran, including students and women who are demanding basic equal rights, basic human dignity. They are calling for just and universal principles which underpin the UN Charter, so on and so forth. For decades, Iran's regime has denied fundamental freedoms to its people and suppressed the aspirations of successive generations through intimidation, coercion, and violence." A little problematic coming from an American world leader, given what America's role in Iran has been over the past century. So from there, I wanted to open that back up to the conversation. And from there, I want to start in with Amnesty International, who is joining us today via their Iran expert, Dr. Elise Auerbach. And ma'am, can you start us off by giving us the 10,000-foot view? Where is Iran now? How dire is the situation? Is it trending in positive directions, negative directions? Ma'am, your floor. You are muted, however, but your floor.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Crocker, and those were fantastic graphics. I would love to get them. So yeah, I should say, just start off with the latest news, which is definitely not good. Is that a young man named Mohsen Shekari was actually executed for crimes he allegedly committed during the protests. So this received a lot of attention today, and I guess people really fear that this is just the beginning of a wave of executions that are going to take place. Amnesty International a few days ago put out a statement that at least 28 people, including 3 juveniles, are actually facing the death penalty in Iran. They're in danger of being executed, and now at least one person has actually been executed. And I should say, this individual was not given a fair trial. He was subjected to torture and ill treatment, which is very common. He was not tried in a criminal court. He was tried in what's called a revolutionary court. He was tried for nebulous national security offenses. Supposedly, he was somehow involved in the stabbing or injuring of a government agent during the protest. But in all of these cases, there's never any real evidence to prove that the person who's being accused of a crime has actually ever committed any kind of a crime. It could be that the person was just at the protest and the authorities decided to go after this person. But it's definitely a very disturbing sign that the government really means business when it comes to punishing people who are involved with these protests. And what happens, of course, is that they publicize this because they want to scare people. They want to shut people down. They want people to get the idea that if they're involved with the protest, they could be subject to the death penalty or certainly imprisonment, very severe punishment. Amnesty International has been more conservative than a lot of organizations, but we've recorded at least 305 people have been killed during these protests. And of that number, at least 41 are juveniles, including some very young kids. And there's some really disturbing reports about some young teenagers who actually were killed in extraordinarily brutal ways, by having their heads and faces smashed in with blunt objects, multiple times until they died. To compound the agony for the families, the authorities very often hold the bodies of the deceased as sort of hostage. because they want the families to be quiet and not make statements to the press. So they sort of they kind of blackmail the families or coerce them. They say, well, you're not going to get the body unless you promise to keep silent. Sometimes they bury the bodies in secret. Don't let the families have access, so they can't, have their own independent autopsies on these on their deceased done. In addition to which, there have been a number of very disturbing reports, for instance, in CNN, that both young women and young men have been sexually assaulted in custody. There have been dozens of reports of that. So these protests are extraordinarily. So they've been going on for almost 3 months now. There doesn't seem to be any sign that they're abating. And the government, as usual, the government responds by just cracking down. They don't want to relent, and so it seems that they're trying to crack down as much as possible. But I should say that I should just to finish, one very positive development, which is something that Amnesty International campaigned for, is that on November 24th, the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva actually voted to establish an independent mechanism to investigate the human rights violations in Iran. So this is something that Amnesty had been really advocating for. We actually signed an open letter with 42 other organizations, human rights organizations, and other organizations, social justice organizations, to ask the UN Human Rights Council to do just that, because we know that the Iranian government cannot act to hold its own agents responsible or accountable for the human rights violations they've committed. So this is a very, very positive step. It happened 2 weeks ago, and we're definitely going to monitor this to make sure that that this body is fully authorized to carry out extensive investigations into the human rights violations.
Can you fact check something for me, ma'am? Because I've read conflicting reports. There was a report that I started talking about in class until one of my very sharp students told me to stop talking about it because it wasn't true. And it was a report out of Iranian's parliament that they had passed some sort of really, they've passed a really draconian punishment law to sentence nonviolent protesters or violent protesters who had been arrested to death, which would potentially subject what the report I read was about 15,000 Iranian protest prisoners to the death penalty. I have since been told that that is not true by students. I have no reason to doubt them, but is that true or what? Well,
I mean, the thing is this, under current Iranian law, and this has been the case for a long time now, there are certain very nebulous crimes, including something called corruption on earth and another crime called enmity against God. And those crimes are really not very well defined. But these crimes have been, in the Iranian Penal Code for quite a long time, and people have been sentenced to death based on these very nebulous crimes. I mean, just recently, a young LGBTQ woman was sentenced to death for corruption on earth because of her advocacy for LGBTQ rights in Iran. This woman was not accused of violence. She was accused of, she was part of a video that had been recorded about, LGBTQ rights. But just her peaceful advocacy for LGBTQ rights got her the death penalty. So right now she's on death row in Iran waiting to be executed. And this is one of the cases we're working on. This is just a perfect example, one example of how the penal code as it stands now can actually be used to execute people for very nebulous crimes, which would not include actually, killing anybody or harming any person.
So I want to say that we are also honored to host an elected local leader, and Dr. Maryam Mohammadkhani, of the SPS school board. I'm not talking about school board today, but an area of overlap between the two of us is that you are extremely passionate about the country of Iran. You are an Iranian immigrant yourself. You've got family there, deep connections there. Ma'am, can you speak a little bit to what you know the attitude on the ground in that country is? Where are the people of Iran right now? Is it hopeless? Is this intractable? Where are we at right now? And what are your personal thoughts and feelings about your home country?
That is such a loaded question.
Yeah, that's how I like to do them. I like to
Oh
load
my
them up.
gosh, I can start now and not stop for an entire month. And I loved everything you both said. And I've just kind of been taking notes because I just kind of want to fill in some of the gaps. I don't even think I'll get to me. You're absolutely correct on the circular election of the supreme leader. So I really appreciated the way that you sort of, there, yeah, we have elections, but it's very circular and there is no democracy. And you explained it very well. So I'm going to go in and just fill in some blanks. The most recent one you talked about is, my father was accused and he was convicted of those two penal codes that have only, I wouldn't say they've been around forever, only 43 years ago. And so that's, one is being at war with God, and the other is being, a literal translation would be the spoiler of society. So bringing corruption into society. And absolutely, they are punishable by death. So up to death. My father, he received a 5-year sentence, but you can receive a death penalty for that. And she's absolutely correct. The first execution happened today. So these are done in, as she said, revolutionary courts. They last about 10 minutes and people are in line for that. Currently, I can just give you one example within our family of 3 girls, 3 women, 2 that were involved in protests. I'm taking a little side, making it personal here for a little bit. There were 3 daughters, 2 were involved. They were identified on cameras, so they were able to track them to their homes. And when they entered the home, they found 3 daughters, so all 3 were taken. The oldest was released. There are 2 girls left. The middle child has been sentenced to 2 years, and she only walked in protests. The youngest, and I'm going to get back to the middle child who has been officially sentenced to 2 years. The youngest child has not been sentenced. She's been released. However, the family's entire wealth, including their home, has been put up as collateral. This is one of their intimidation techniques. So they don't allow you to see your child. She's been in there now for several weeks. In order to see your child, you have to pay 20 million tomans per visit. To kind of give you an idea of how much that is, in today's dollars, that would be $600. And it may not seem like a lot, but an average salary is 5 million tomans. So just to see your child or a loved one, you have to give up 4 months' salary. And so it's difficult. They were able to finally get a visit, and they are brutalized in prisons, repeatedly beaten. And I know they say that there's allegations of sexual assault. Those are not allegations. Those actually happen, and you are actually sentenced to rape. And it's kind of hard to get your head around that, wrap your head around that, but that you're actually sentenced to rape. And the people who rape, they see it as their duty, so it's like a hardship for them. This isn't something they enjoy. So not only are you imprisoned and beaten, but rape is actually something that you can be sentenced to, repeated rapes within prisons, regardless of your age and of your sex. Okay, so I wanted to get to the holding the bodies hostage. That is absolutely correct. They do that as an intimidation technique. And this is a little side note that people don't realize. So burial in Islam is very important. The sooner you bury someone, the sooner you go into the ground. This is not a cultural, this is a religious note to make. I don't know if people actually believe this, that, this is your path to heaven, but that's a custom. And that it's, in a way, the longer you are outside, the worse it is for you. And I don't know how to even transcribe that because you're already dead. But it's very symbolic. And so there's a huge rush to bury the body. And it probably stems from this region being very hot in 1400 years ago. So it's like an Islamic edict because it's very hot. And if you didn't bury the bodies, it'd just be a horrible mess. And it would stink, and there'd be a lot of diseases and spread. And so one of the pillars of Islam is a rapid burial. And families feel a lot of stress to bury their bodies. And yes, they use that as an intimidation technique. I made all these little notes as she was
Can
speaking
I
to make
can
sure
I
I
ask you something about your home country? Um,
sure.
when I was asked in class, I was asked in class by a very sharp student, but he asked me a question after a discussion about Iran, about the Taliban. No, Taliban is Afghanistan.
No.
Listen,
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about the fact that Iran is actually really modern and really shares a lot in terms of modern personal behavior? And really, that's one of the
Sure.
reasons. Go ahead, ma'am.
Yeah. So Taliban, they're Sunnis and Iranians are Shiites. So that is a significant. But let me back up. And I guess I'll give you a really back view. Let me just spend a couple minutes talking about Iran. So Iran is million and a half, 25, now pushing 2,600 years in age. It is a country that has this long history that goes way beyond the birth of Islam. Islam's been around only about 1,400 years. So this country's history is so much more rich. And it is where science and mathematics was born. They've had kings and they've had queens. Um, you know, they have a culture that is rich in music, in poetry. Many of the world-renowned poets are Iranians, in dance. They're very culturally rich in terms of food. And so they come with this extensive history. And then about 1,400 years ago, Islam walked into the picture, and they were Zoroastrists. And most people don't even know what a Zoroastrist is, but they believe in a God, so one God. And and there has been this, oh my gosh, we could talk about the infiltration of Islam within Iran, but one of the reasons Iranians identify themselves as being Shiite is because if Islam was, we'll say, forced upon them, because it was, they lost in that war. Um, they lost in the war, and they had to convert because they were toppled, right? And they were in their homes. The Arabs, the countries was infiltrated. The language has been infiltrated. The more east you go, the Afghans speak a more truer version of Persian or Iranian than we do, because we had been infiltrated by the Arabs for so long. So there's been this systematic infusion of Islam within the culture. So they're married and they're intertwined. Um, and that's really been a source of a lot of tension. The country struggles because there's the secularism, and then there's still this deep-rooted Islam. And this is what's happening right now. And this has been happening for centuries. And at least in my family, my parents, I was raised to think of Iran as like a blade of grass. It has been stepped on, it's gone up and down. It goes all the way down, but it never breaks, and it stands up again. So if we turn the clock back and look at 1979, so that's the Islamic Revolution, at that time, women had enjoyed, and people enjoyed the same freedoms that we enjoy today in Western countries. So people had social freedoms, they had personal freedoms. And when I say personal freedom is you do what you want, where you want, when you want, with who you want. They had economic freedoms. They had freedom to travel. Um, they had all these freedoms. There's only one freedom they didn't have, and that was they didn't have political freedom. And that was a really sore spot. You can always argue, and I like
Yeah,
to look at things.
you're welcome for that, by the way. That was the United States handiwork there.
So you can always argue, does anybody really have political freedom? So at the time, it's the height of the Cold War. And we, as your map showed, now you have Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan, but at the time that wasn't like that. It was just Russia, and Mother Russia sat right above us. And this created a lot of tension. So there was a large communist basis. And this all started after World War II. There's so much that goes into this, but you were not allowed to have an official red party. You were also in red as in a communist party. You're also not allowed to be a part of the Black Party, and the Black Party was the Islamic clerics. In fact, they were in exile because the country had modernized quite rapidly, and it had met a lot of resistance from the clerics. When I say modernized, that means schooling was free. There was free healthcare for all, free schooling, and if you got into an external university, it was all expenses paid, your living, the university payments.
So
There was a severe affirmative action for getting women into the workforce. I'm sorry, go ahead.
that's okay, if I may jump in. So what the Iranian Revolution, I'm sorry, the Islamic Revolution brought was, because it's true, prior to that, Iran was, I mean, it'd be hard to distinguish it from some Western nations, very
Yeah,
modern.
it was
But of
like
course-
Paris. It was the
but of
Paris
course-
of the Middle East.
That's a great way of saying, politically though, no self-determination. Now, what the Islamic Revolution did was it gave Iran a little bit of self-determination, albeit under a theocracy, while also squashing a ton of those social freedoms. Now, could you clarify something for me? Because it just seems,
Sure.
because I remember the Green Revolution of 2000, what was it, 10, 11?
There was the 2009 Green Revolution, yes.
So it just seems from an outsider who is as not baked into the culture there as you are, that the people of Iran, especially these newer generations, is getting increasingly secular and perhaps you'd argue modern, while the government system there, as we've seen already, is kind of resistant to that modernization. And it's creating this tinderbox that the Amini, the death of Amini seems to have kicked off. Does that ring true to you, or how might you clarify that?
Yes, but there's another twist. And if I may, I'll finish my thought earlier, which is, so people were looking for political freedom that they felt like they didn't have. And unfortunately, in that exchange, they gave up all their freedoms, right? They don't have the freedom to eat what they want, to go where they want. They can't even dress how they want. You can't travel. Women can't travel without the permission of their spouse or their guardian. People have no freedoms. And in that exchange, they also lost their political freedom. There is no political freedom. So they went after that one thing, and in the exchange, they lost everything. Because in that skirmish, although everybody came together to topple the Shah, the king of Iran, and what most people don't realize is the country was divided. People aren't all Persians. You know, we think of America as being a melting pot. It's not a melting pot. You've got the Kurds and you've got the Armenians. You'll have the Turks to the north. Mahsa Amini was she was a Kurdish girl, and that's why. And these people are very, very proud, and they have always wanted their independence. So this is a country that's a patchwork of different ethnics and different cultural backgrounds, and they had been put together by a strong king. So everybody wanted their freedom. And the religious clerics and the Communist Party, they all came under this, and there was this uprising. But unfortunately, they were quick to get control and quick to execute. They executed thousands and thousands of people in their quest for power. And they continue and they remain in power. And talk about how ruthless they are. Khamenei arrested his own niece and has also given the instructions to arrest his sister, which is the mother of his niece, because they have spoken out against him. So there is zero political freedom in Iran right now. And I probably shouldn't have even said the things I said because this is recorded.
Well,
And I still dream of going back. But these are the facts.
Dr. Auerbach, can I ask you about that exact thing? Because obviously one of the reasons why people in the country right now, and I would like to open this up to the floor here in a minute, but obviously one of the reasons why social freedoms are suppressed in the country is because of the quote unquote morality police. Now, Iran said recently, I want you to weigh in on this, ma'am. Iran said recently that they are going to disband, or at least, what did they say about the morality police, ma'am? First of all, can you clarify what they said about what they're going to do with the morality police? Sounded like they're going to disband them. And then second of all, is that going to be enough to really not squash, but settle these protests, or is there more on the horizon?
Okay, well, first of all, uh, there have been contradictory statements issued by the Iranian authorities about the morality police. So, I mean, the fact of the matter is that, since the protests started in the middle of September, after September 16th, the morality police had been less less visible, I guess you could say, on the streets. But of course, they've been replaced by these armed agents of the government who've used indiscriminate force to kill and injure hundreds, if not thousands, of people. Yeah, I mean, the protests were, kind of like kicked off because of the death of Mahsa Amini. But this, I mean, in her case, I mean, this was a young woman who was not setting out to make a deliberate statement. She was not an activist. She was visiting Tehran with her family. And, according to all accounts, she actually was wearing hijab. It's just, somehow it may have slipped off, part of her head or something like that. But the problem is for many years, for a very long time, especially since Raisi has become president, and the morality police would terrorize women. They were given carte blanche to accost women and brutalize them. And I actually watched a video, sort of a video compilation of women who'd been accosted by the morality police. This is before Mahsa Amini was taken into custody. And, it was just appalling to see the way they were treating these women. They were treating them literally like bags of garbage that, stuffing them into these vans, with smashing them into the side of the van so that their heads were smashing into the sides of the van, sort of stuffing them in as if they were just oversized bags of garbage, literally. And so, so this is something that had been going on for a long time. Everybody in Iran probably has known somebody or experienced it themselves or known somebody who's been accosted by the morality police. So most Iranians really felt like Mahsa Amini could be their sister or their daughter. This could happen to anyone, something, I mean, and it was really almost like it was just a matter of time before someone would actually be killed, based on the brutal treatment. And, there was never any accountability. They were just told, you can just, do whatever you feel like. And so these people, the people in the morality police, just, had a free hand to treat people however they wanted to. One thing, I think that's, I don't think, I mean, even if the morality police is disbanded, and again, there have been contradictory messages, I'll see it when I believe it. But I don't think that's going to appease people. I mean, there have been protests in Iran over the course of several years now because of various things like, fuel prices, astronomical fuel prices, corruption, the downing of the plane a few years ago, so there are a lot of grievances in Iran. Of course, there are just so many grievances. I mean, workers, for instance. Many workers, and especially in the public sector, don't get paid regularly. One thing that when people talk about the clerical regime, I think one thing that people should remember is that there's actually another group that has a huge amount of influence on the Iranian government, and that is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. These are elite. These are elite military people. They're the true power behind the throne. I mean, in a lot of ways, Khamenei is very dependent on them. But the Revolutionary Guard Corps controls vast swaths of the Iranian economy. Huge sectors of the Iranian economy are controlled by the Revolutionary Guards. And these people do not want to relinquish their grip on Iran because they don't want to relinquish all the profits they've made in the Iranian economy. If there were, a more democratic system, obviously, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps would not be able to have this ability to control the economy as they do. So it's a real problem, how to, if the Revolutionary Guards, controls, the pie, trying to get them to share their pie with others is a real challenge. And I do think in a lot of ways, people like Khamenei, are, they're, I don't know if you can say they're answerable to the Revolutionary Guards, but they have to take their interests into consideration all the time.
So at this moment, if anybody following along,
can I just kind of follow up on that?
Yes, you may.
Because that's really important for people, for the students to understand what a important and central role the Revolutionary Guard and Basij is another way to refer to them. And their morality police is actually part of this. So this is another genius thing that the mullahs did. And when I say mullah, that's the ruling clerics. In the 1979 revolution, the military turned on the king and locked hand in hand with the people. And at its inception, the Islamic Republic recognized that the military may eventually be a problem for them. And so they created this Revolutionary Guard to protect themselves. And they purposefully made it just, if not more powerful. And the difference between them and the military, they all have guns, but is the economic power that the Revolutionary Guard has. So, and it has fed into what I believe, and I know you asked Dr. Auerbach this question, but I would like to answer it too. If they back off, first, I don't believe they will back off. I've listened to several news sources and several clips. That was a misunderstanding. There's no intention. Even if they did back off, because they are the face of the Islamic Republic, hijab is not going anywhere. But even if it did, it is too little, too late, because the crux of the problem isn't Mahsa Amini or hijab or women's rights. The crux of the issue is the economic hardships that people have. And so to them, it doesn't matter if they go out and protest, because they contemplate suicide on a daily basis. So what does it matter whether I'm going to die anyway, because I literally don't have food. So the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, they have all the water in the rural. So 2009 and 2019, these were large city protests. The protests now are nationwide, and they're within the rural communities, including in Kurdistan, where Mahsa Amini is. They don't have the farmers don't have water to grow their produce or to even feed themselves. But who has the water? The IRGC is taking the water to grow flowers and to grow pistachios, to export, to line their own pockets. I'll stop there.
And it's a tough situation, as you described, for America in a way, because right now, it's worth mentioning, it's kind of forgotten, but the Biden administration for the past 2 years has been negotiating with Iran about containing their nuclear ambitions. And in order for America and the Western world to do that, they need to alleviate some of the economic sanctions we've put on Iran. Doing so would actually improve economic conditions on the ground throughout the country, and therefore ease up, perhaps, according to some of the arguments you guys have made, on the protests there.
I don't agree with you.
You don't think so?
No, because there's too much corruption. Obama gave them how many millions and millions of dollars? It didn't go to the people. It goes to their mercenaries who they have hired. They don't have enough people to kill their people. They've run out of Basijis because they are deflecting. So what they are doing is it's tat for tat, right? They support Syria. They are the exporters of terrorism. They're in Libya, they're in Syria, they're in Iraq. And guess what? They have those people in Iran with guns killing Iranians. It is so much easier to have a mercenary kill your people. It's easier to kill someone whose language you don't speak. And that's where the money will go, because they are ruthless and they will do anything to maintain power.
I would like to, if anybody following along has a thought they'd like to share or a question for either speaker, feel free to share your thoughts. I'll give you guys a minute to weigh in if you'd like to. Although, goodness knows, Dr. Auerbach, Dr. Mohammadkhani, and myself could talk forever about this.
There's been a lot of protests. I don't know if Dr. Auerbach, if you've been following it, but there's been incredible protests by the Iranians and other people in Germany, Canada. Have you been seeing some of these images? A lot in America, in DC,
Turkey.
in New York, in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
It's really powerful to watch.
Oh yeah, yeah, no, I've participated in protests here in Chicago, and
Oh, in Chicago as well? Excellent.
Once again, would like to keep that floor open for anybody that wants to weigh in on thoughts about this conversation. Although no issues here with the three of us continuing to rattle on about it.
Do you see
We
the
have a question.
questions?
We
Oh,
have a
here.
question from Yi. She says, hi, my name is Yi. Nice to meet you on Zoom. She says, I'm an Asian immigrant here. I have an Iranian friend. I talked to him a couple days ago about this topic. He told me that the main point of this problem is all about bad understanding of religion in the Iran government. He said Iranians don't want the Islamic Republic. They want to change the regime to a non-religious system. Dr. Auerbach, what are the chances of, relative to a snowball's chance in hell, that a secular system might have a future thanks to these protests?
Well, Amnesty International does not take a position about what kind of government should exist in any country. We don't say that there should be or should not be, an Islamic Republic in Iran. Just like, we don't comment on the kind of government in China. We don't comment on the kind of government that's in Saudi. What we do say is that all countries around the world have to adhere to international human rights standards. Iran is part of the United Nations, so as part of the United Nations, they have to adhere to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They've agreed to a whole bunch of international treaties and human rights instruments. And, they're subject to the authority of the UN Human Rights Council and other UN bodies. They've not cooperated with these bodies. For instance, several years ago, the UN appointed a special rapporteur for the situation of human rights in Iran. And now we're on the third individual who's held that position. And they've always requested access to Iran, and the Iranian authorities have never granted access. Amnesty International has asked for access to Iran to do investigations, to be trial monitors and so forth, and we've never been granted access to Iran. Although we actually did get a meeting with the Iran human rights with the Iran UN mission in New York in 2014. That was the only time that we've actually been able to meet with the Iranian officials. Question about what kind of government should exist in Iran. Again, we can't comment about what kind of government should exist. What we can comment on is that, every government is obliged to uphold, agreed upon international human rights standards, and the current Iranian government is most decidedly not adhering to human rights standards.
Dr. Mohammadkhani, you yourself, according to things you had said, you do not sound optimistic about about a non-religion system.
I'm actually really optimistic, and I'll tell you, there's a couple things that feed into it. Meet Iran's new generation. It's Generation X and Generation Y and Z that follows my Generation X. They currently make up, so these are individuals who were born in the late 80s, 90s, and the turn of the century. And they were teenagers when the 2009 and the 2019 uprisings occurred. And they are the ones that are participating. And they create more than 60% of the roughly 87 million population. It's a really significant number. And this is a generation that grew up with technology, and they have information at their fingertips. So the tweets about Mahsa Amini, there were 1 million tweets within half an hour before they did the crackdown. So I think that this is something that is a completely new way of looking. This isn't Iran the traditional way. This Gen Y and Gen Z is extremely powerful, one. And this is the generation that sees what's happening in the rest of the world. They can communicate with the rest of the world. They've They're awake, right? And on top of it, they have witnessed 2009, 2019, 20, and now 2022, right? There has never been this much brutality and vicious, and I mean vicious behavior. And it's all done repeatedly, and it's done in the name of Islam. There's that, you know, and I have to give credit to why they're doing this. They are upholding the Islamic ideals. And so when they kill a girl or when they imprison her and when they have these penal codes, they're upholding Islamic law. So when you look at this generation and you look at what they've witnessed, I think Iran, and this is what they've been struggling with Islam and the clerics, I think this is Iran's best chance at finally developing a constitution that is secular, where religion can live side by side, but not as part of the fabric of government.
Dr. Auerbach, if you could, one of the things we had this question on the flyer that we've all seen. The last question is, what should America do? Now, when it comes to Iran particularly, and I'd like to hear Dr. Mohammadkhani's thoughts on this as well. American involvement in Iran, a bad history. What can America do to push towards this future that Dr. Mohammadkhani is potentially describing?
Well, one thing I do want to say is that, you know, the Iranian authorities claim that they're, you know, they base their penal code and their practices on their particular interpretation of Islamic law. But that is not something that's universally recognized, certainly. I mean, it's very contested. So I would not say that the Iranian authorities, you know, represent or uphold, you know, generally agreed upon Islamic law. They have a very particular interpretation of that, and again, it's very contested. I mean, a lot of, you know, there have been a lot of clerics in Iran, a lot of you know, very senior clerics in Iran who've actually contested, you know, even the whole concept of the you know, the supreme leader in Iran. And one example I would like to give is, I mean, you know, in Iran right now, I mean, Iran is has been the number 2 executioner in the world for many years now. Iran executes more people than any other country except for China. Iran is one of the very few countries in the world that continues to execute juvenile offenders, you know, people who've committed their alleged crimes before they were 18 years old. But, you know, there has been a movement in Iran to eradicate the death penalty based on Islamic principles. You know, there was a very prominent, well, he's still alive. His name is Ahmad-Din Baghi. He's actually a scholar. He was a prisoner of conscience that we actually worked on for many years. And he actually wrote a very, very long and very scholarly work about eradicating the death penalty based on Islamic principles. You know, so he was basing his arguments against the death penalty on Islamic principles, his own interpretation of Islamic principles. So I would not blame Islam, you know, for the problems in Iran. The problems are with the people who've made these decisions, you know, to weaponize, you know, their own interpretation of Islam to terrorize and oppress their people in Iran. So, you know, and, you know, so I would, you know, there are plenty of, you know, I mean, you know, you can't blame Islam for the problems in Iran. I think these are people who just refuse to adhere to international human rights standards. But when it comes to what people can do, actually, Amnesty International does not lobby the U.S. government on Iran at all. We actually ask our activists to lobby the Iranian government directly. And we ask, we bombard them with letters. We write to prisoners of conscience and their families directly to support them. And we've also, again, we ask international bodies like the UN Human Rights Council to set up this investigative body. We've always asked for the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Iran to be renewed. We've always, every year, there's a resolution on Iran that comes up before the UN General Assembly, and we've always asked that this be that this resolution condemning human rights violations in Iran be passed. We submit every 5 years. Iran is subject to a universal periodic review in the United Nations. We always submit, a document, a long report about its violations. So we want the international body, the UN and other international bodies to stand up and speak out against human rights violations in Iran. As you pointed out, I mean, the US government has a very difficult history with Iran, and we have not found that that asking for any intervention by the US government would be helpful.
Dr. Mohammadkhani, does that ring true to you? Is there anything that you can see in your mind's eye that America might do other than butt out?
I fundamentally disagree on several points that Dr. Auerbach has made. And one of them is on the point of American intervention, and the other is on putting blame on Islam. In no way did I, shape, or form try to blame Islam, any of this, but this is a generation that is seeing these acts in the name of Islam. And I feel that part of the problem is our people who haven't walked a mile in my shoes, and who continually give Islam a pass. And that must stop. And it's very frustrating because some of these laws are subject to interpretation. Regardless, this is how they have been interpreted. And this is the memory that it has created for this young generation. So whether Islam is right or wrong is not at stake. It is not the question. It's whether it will survive. And when this has happened, it decreases its chances of survival. And I think as a non-Muslim, you have to be very careful when you continually defend something that you don't know very much about. So I'll leave that as that. In the terms
As far
of
as
what can
American
America
intervention,
do,
yeah.
As far as American intervention, there is something America can do. And I'm going out on a limb and saying this, but in my heart of hearts, I believe that this is one form of intervention. I don't feel it's necessary because at the end of the day, the Iranians brought this on themselves. And it is time. You are responsible for your choices. And this is a choice they made. They chose this government, not them, but their ancestors, right? Their parents and grandparents. And in my heart, I believe until those grandparents who deeply regret what they did, until every single one come out on the streets, and until thousands, maybe millions lose their lives, that this battle will not be won, because it needs to be won by the people of that country. But what can certainly help them in terms of foreign intervention is simply put, guns. The people have some guns. The Kurds are the only ones who have guns, the people of Mahsa Amini's tribe. Because in the '79 revolution, when they went and took out police, because this is a country that doesn't have guns, right? This is how America's unique, in that individuals have guns. And so in the previous regime, they didn't have guns either. And the king was the ruler. It's how it's been for some time. But when the revolution occurred, the people seized guns. Because you look at these images and you're like, how do people have guns? These guns are 43 years old. They took these guns, they wrapped them in plastic, and they buried them in sand along the Kurdish region. They're very smart. The Kurds did that. So we have guns. People have guns, but it's not enough. So it's people versus guns. And if they could have something, so they're using cocktail Molotov, what's the word for it? Molotov cocktails, I guess. Right. They're using very rudimentary guerrilla style warfare. I think it could help. But at the end of the day, it is up to the people to to stand up for themselves. And they will pay a huge price, but that price will hopefully last this go around centuries.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Auerbach for taking an hour out of her day, Dr. Mohammadkhani for lending your time. I know you guys are both very busy. I want to thank the students for pushing for this conversation. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and OTC, of course, for facilitating the fact that events like this can even happen. Thank you so much. I think it goes without saying that I kind of agree with both of you. I don't see this going anywhere. And even if this particular protest doesn't exact the change that the people would like, I don't think that problem's going anywhere for a while either. So regardless, the rest of the world community and we here in this club will be watching the developments very closely.
I do want to add that I really enjoyed this, and I learned a lot from Dr. Auerbach, and I thank you, because I learned things that I didn't know before, and it was very valuable listening to you. And do you have a way that I can follow you on? I don't do social media, but I only do stuff with Iran on Instagram. Is there any way that I could follow you, or the students can, so they can stay up to date, because it's the work you do is so important?
In the chat, I'll enter in our social media handles.
Okay.
Dr. Auerbach, before we go, I'm going to give you just 60 seconds. I'm sorry, it's a short one, but can you wrap us up and send us off?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. I have found, that to be an activist working on Iran, you have to be committed to the long haul. And we've actually had a number of successes over the years. They've been very hard-won successes. But we actually have been able to secure the release of a number of prisoners of conscience, setting aside death penalties, ensuring that people have not been executed, improving the conditions for prisoners of conscience in Iran's prisons. So I would definitely not want people to lose hope. Right now, actually, just I want to promote one Amnesty action, which is a very easy action to take. Every December, we do an action called Right for Rights, which is it's sort of focused on Human Rights Day, which is actually this coming Saturday, December 10th is Human Rights Day. And we ask people to take action on a few cases. If you go to our website, www.amnestyusa.org, and click on Right for Rights, you'll see that one of the cases we're working on is a young man named Vahid Afkari, who was actually arrested in a previous round of protests. He and his two brothers were arrested. One of his brothers was executed in 2020, sadly. But Vahid has been sentenced to an incredible 33 years in prison. He was severely tortured. He was, coerced to making a confession, which was publicized, which was televised, which is a very common technique. But we're focusing on, he is one of the cases we're focusing on. So if people want to do something, I would definitely urge you to write on behalf of Vahid Afkari. He's part of our Protect the Protest campaign. So we're acting, again, he was arrested in the previous round, but given this long 33-year sentence, just for exercising his rights to freedom of expression and assembly. So that's an action that you all can take. It's a very easy action to do. And we hope to get thousands, if not 10,000s of actions that would be directed to the Iranian government to show that the world is watching, which is very, very important.
Dr. Auerbach?
Thank you. Thank you. My apologies for calling it at this point. It is 5:01. I will keep the Zoom open though for continued conversation. Thank you everybody for joining us today, and let's keep our eyes on the situation. Keep your thoughts and prayers with Iran. Thank you.
Dr. Auerbach, is there a way that I can follow you on Instagram?